Well, hello and welcome. My name is William Hild. I'm the Executive Director of Consumers Research, the nation's oldest consumer protection organization. We're honored to be joined today by Oren Cass. We're going to talk a little bit about inflation, but before I do that, I'd just like to note for our viewers that this month, Consumers Research has launched consumersbulletin.org, the digital version of our magazine that dates back to 1931. So please take a moment and check that out. Before we get started, let me introduce Oren. He's the executive director of American Compass, an organization he founded at the beginning of last year. He's also the author of The Once and Future Worker, a vision for the renewal of work in America. He is a contributing opinion writer for the Financial Times, and his work also appears regularly in publications, including the New York Times and Wall Street Journal. He has a JD from Harvard Law School, where he graduated magna cum laude. And while still in law school, Oren also became domestic policy director for Governor Mitt Romney's 2012 presidential campaign. He joined the Manhattan Institute as a senior fellow in 2015, and that's where he was working last year when he published The Cost of Thriving Index, reevaluating the prosperity of the American family, which of course is the subject of today's seminar. So welcome, Oren.
Hey, thanks for having me.
And real quick, before we launch into it, I just want to say a quick note on what we mean when we discuss inflation for the purposes of this webinar. That word has a number of different meanings, both colloquial and as a term of art within economics. It can be meant just the expansion of the size of the money supply. But I think when we mean it in the colloquial sense, when the average person says, oh, inflation's through the roof, prices are going up, I mean the general state of price increases that consumers are facing. And that's really what motivated us to invite you on today. We think that, at least my view is, a lot of times these days, when you hear inflation discussed, it's in context sort of outside of the consumer, even though consumer is in the name of the CPI, the Consumer Price Index. It's in terms often of government policy, whether the Fed should raise or lower rates, whether you should be investing in gold or inflation-adjusted bonds or growth stocks. It has all of these different guidepost uses for other areas. But I feel like in the context of the national discussion, the C in CPI has sort of gotten lost. And so thank you so much for coming on today, and thank you, audience, for joining us to have a discussion. First of all, I think just for the audience, Oren, could you talk a little bit about there are a couple of different government measures of inflation. And could you just walk us through very briefly what those are and what they mean?
Yeah, sure. I think exactly as you put it. You've got the CPI, which has the word consumer right in it, but the word's not there because we're looking at things as consumers experience them. We're looking at essentially what do consumers buy as the set of things whose prices we want to measure, and that's kind of the core challenge with measuring inflation is well, what counts, right? I mean, you could imagine. And actually, The Economist for a long time had something very famous called the Big Mac Index, which basically just looked at the price of the Big Mac in every country in the world. And to understand how prices were rising, how currencies compared to each other, you just looked at Big Macs. There are some really nice things about that. Obviously, there are some things that you might miss if you were only looking at Big Macs. And so economists have tried to do a lot better than that. And the CPI takes the approach of looking at a basket of things that consumers buy and asking basically, what do consumers say they spend their money on? And let's go look at how the prices of those things are changing. The other approach that's typically used is the PCE. And here we're looking at P producers. And there we're asking more, well, what do people make? And how are the prices changing the things that people make? And you can imagine the ways these would therefore look different. And the really biggest example that plays into the data is when you ask consumers what they spend on, you see a huge focus on housing related costs. And so CPI very heavily weights what's going on in housing. On the other hand, you miss a lot in terms of things like healthcare or higher education, where there's so much government subsidy and the insurance comes through the employer, and well, what's the actual tuition at the college? Who knows? Those things will show up less if you're just asking consumers what they pay every month. Whereas if you're asking healthcare providers or insurers or hospitals what it costs to each month, or you're asking colleges what they spend each month, you're going to get a different view. And so those tend to be the two views that are focused on, and which one you prefer depends somewhat on what you're asking. Although in my experience, to a larger extent, it depends on what answer you're looking for, and then folks tend to choose the one that gives them the trend that they want to emphasize.
Got it. So it gives any policy analyst sort of some optionality, which
Yes.
best supports their argument. Well, taking a quick step back to sort of a meta level, thank you for sort of articulating the PCE and CPI government stats. Going, I guess, probably a couple years back, I don't know how long you were working on the report, but when you first started, what gave you the idea to write this report? What were some of the things that you were seeing that were troubling to you? And sort of give us a little bit of the motivation you saw and sort of the issues you were seeing that said, I want to take a look at this and do a deeper dive into some of these issues.
Yeah, sure. I think the key thing to recognize about both of these measures, or really any measure of inflation as it's typically used by economists, is it's not actually measuring the cost of living as experienced by a family. It's trying to understand something very specific, which is how has the cost changed if you are trying to buy the exact same set of things. And that's a really important question if you want to know, is there too much money, in circulation? Is the economy overheating? The actual price of the exact same apple can tell you a lot. But the reality for a family is that pressures on household budgets look very different than that. Certainly, if the general price level is rising, that could be a factor. But the flip side is that almost by definition, if the general price level is rising, wages are rising too. In fact, the original impetus for the government to figure out how to calculate these things at the start of the 20th century was, in many cases, for the purpose of putting into contracts to account for wage increases, because workers wanted to see that wages were increasing at the same rate as prices. So you would actually be very surprised to find a situation where inflation was per se putting pressure on household budgets. But there are an awful lot of other things that go on in an economy and a society that can put very serious pressure on household budgets. And if you think for families about, what's affecting their ability to make ends meet, it's less likely to be, the cost of beef is rising at 1.3% per year. And it's a lot more likely to be, well, health insurance is rising at 12% a year. I'm supposed to be sending my kids to college, and college now, costs $150,000 and these sorts of things. And economists rightly will say, well, that's not what we're trying to measure here. One reason that health insurance has gotten so much more expensive is because it covers so much more stuff. So what is in health insurance, the actual costs of the services, the access to the life-saving procedures, from an economist's perspective, there's no inflation there. You get what you pay for. But from a family's perspective, you can't go back and consume 1970 level healthcare instead, nor should we ask people to. And so that's a real problem. Likewise, if our society is shifting to a place where people feel like they need a college degree, that's a sudden huge increase in cost, even if the actual what you get for your time in the classroom might not have changed very much at all. And so it seemed to me that what families were experiencing was not connecting with what economists were talking about. And it wasn't because either side was lying or misunderstanding. They were just talking about different things. And so I set out to say, well, what if we didn't try to answer those narrow economic questions? What if we tried to actually understand what is causing families to feel like they're under pressure? Because I don't think it's in their imagination.
That's great. Well, you do a great job in the report of walking through some of the statistical assumptions that have to be made in order to make that apples to apples comparison in the CPI that can be unintentionally, as you articulate, misleading for the consumer who might be trying to understand the direction that prices are going. Could you walk through some of those assumptions? I know one of them is commonly called the hedonic adjustment or the quality adjustment, but there are others, so I'll let you answer the ones you think are most pertinent. But I know that that's always one that's always struck me as being interesting, because it gets to that issue of how do you compare a 2020 Apple to a 1980s Apple. Those probably haven't changed very much, but a lot of other products like televisions and that kind of thing have.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. There are lots of little technical adjustments that even I don't find especially interesting. The quality adjustment one, or hedonic adjustment, is hugely important. And it's funny that we're talking about apples, because there's sort of an iPhone joke to be made here, which is that, yes, to your point, an apple of 1980 versus today is relatively the same thing. And so if its price has gone up, then that reflects inflation. The much more interesting and difficult question for economists, and then for families as well, is, well, how do we compare the cost of an iPhone today to the cost of a flip phone in 2005, to the cost of, no one had mobile phones and you just needed a landline in 1990? And that's a really tough thing to figure out. And so economists do, I think, very good work trying to figure out, well, how do we actually account for the various ways that some products are better than others? How do we look at consumers' willingness to pay more for some things than other as a proxy for that? And therefore say, yes, you may now look at what you pay for an iPhone, and it's, it depends on your plan and all sorts of other things, but let's say an iPhone costs $500 to $1,000, whereas a flip phone cost $100 and a landline costs $20. But that's not actual inflation, right? Because the iPhone has 100 times the processing power of the Apollo mission, or whatever you're going to say. In fact, it's actually the opposite. And it's very interesting to look in technology. When economists try to quantify, well, how much better is an iPhone than an old landline, they actually come to the opposite conclusion, that, yeah, you might be paying $1,000, but, and there's been some fun stuff showing, to get all of the functions of an iPhone, the camera, the day planner, and so forth, in 1990, you would have had to pay $5,000 for that set of things, and you would have then had to drag them around in a suitcase.
You had to add the cost of a backpack.
Right.
Yeah.
So in fact, they would say, actually, the iPhone is incredibly deflationary. You now get that for a fraction of what it would have cost you in the past. And I think that's entirely valid, again, from trying to understand what is happening to price levels. But I think it's equally valid for a family to say, well, but wait a minute, to function in modern society, I kind of feel like I need to have one of these. And maybe not need in the, shelter and food sense, but in the, if I want to feel like a kind of member of the middle class and full participant in society, I need this. My kids, by the time they're 13, are going to be demanding one too. And so if we're talking about how trying to measure how well off is a family, what is their cost of living, I think we have to say that what in 1990 was the cost of a landline, the equivalent in 2020 is now a family plan with data and 3 or 4 iPhones. And we shouldn't minimize how wonderful that is. We should celebrate the incredible progress it represents that we can have that. But we should also be able to acknowledge that there's a reason that families are looking at their budget and saying, there are these costs like this that are there that we didn't need when we were thinking about making ends meet in the past.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I think, obviously with a landline, that's an exception to what I'm about to say. But in a lot of times, if you look at maybe a different type of product like cars, cars have undoubtedly gotten safer, more fuel efficient, improved, all kinds of bells and whistles that feeds into the calculations for the hedonic adjustment, and should. That said, I can't go buy a brand new 1996 Honda Civic. I'm forced, when a consumer enters the market for cars, they have only the selections at 2020 cars at 2020 prices. They don't, and undoubtedly there are car manufacturers who've aimed at the lower price level and done a good job improving the products at the same time. I'm not trying to discard progress, but one of the things that I liked about your discussion of that is it talks about there are certain things that you now almost have to have in order to be a member of the sort of middle class of America, be part of the American dream. And those are increasingly, you don't get to buy the 1970s deflated prices if you're willing to give up the quality increases. You have to pay for all of it. So that's a great point. You brought up another major adjustment, and you alluded to it at the beginning of our discussion about healthcare. Could you walk through a little bit about the risk sharing issues with sort of how healthcare inflation is calculated and how that works?
Yeah, I think there's a really interesting sort of subset of products which are basically insurance products, and health insurance is the big one, that are just sort of their own special case. And so I think it's really important to think about what kinds of options we have in the market for something like health insurance, and what are the factors that determine what we have to pay for it. Because what happens with insurance products is by definition, they are risk pooling or risk sharing products. The idea is each of us individually, hopefully, is going to spend very little in that category, but we are all going to pay in to cover whatever the expenses of those who really have the high costs are. And that creates two really interesting issues for the typical family. One is that the package of benefits that we are going to define as insurance is going to be driven by sort of the progress and growth in the economy overall. So the level of technological advancement, frankly, to a large degree, what higher income households and elite policymakers take for granted as standard and expect. And then to the extent also that the culture defines, these things now exist. These cancer treatments are there, and we think that's part of what it means to try to take care of somebody and save their life. Well, that applies for everybody, not just the people whose incomes have been rising. And so the insurance package that you have to pay for if you want to be in the risk pool isn't just defined by what you can afford. It's to a large part defined by what other people can afford. And so, as you were saying, you can't go get a 1970s insurance package. The insurance package is going to go up much more sharply in cost. And again, you can say it's worth every penny, but it won't show up as inflation, and yet it will show up as a huge cost for families. And so that's one problem. The second problem, then, when you think about, how well off does the family feel that it is that most people don't use their insurance. And that's a good thing, right? I mean, it is a blessing to not need the pediatric cancer treatment, obviously. But what that means is that if you think about the actual things that the family is consuming, they are now paying in, let's say, $15,000 in health insurance premium, but they're still only using the $400 or $500 of care if they're just getting their regular preventive visits. And so again, we define them from an inflation perspective. We say, well, because they are entitled to the care if they need it, they are getting the $15,000 of value. And there's one way in which that's absolutely true. But for the 95% of families who don't need the high cost care, potentially ever, or certainly at a given point in time, they are rightly going to say, well, wait a minute, I'm not consuming or getting any benefit that I wasn't getting 15, 20 years ago, and yet I'm paying an extra $10,000. And so that's another way, again, where the economist's view isn't wrong. It's just not describing how the family is experiencing what they have to pay for versus what they're getting.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Are there any additional, obviously you mentioned there's all kinds of adjustments we could go into, but is there any other general types of adjustments that the CPI makes that sort of, again, not to mislead anybody, they answer a very narrow question that sort of the broad consumer base as they experience it wouldn't feel that way?
Well, I think there's one other sort of interesting detail that's actually, it's a philosophical question more than anything else, which comes down to the question of substitution. And, in the very concrete sense, we can go back to apples on this one. And you think about apples and oranges in the supermarket. And supposing you have a situation where apples get much more expensive, one thing people are going to do is they're going to shift and buy relatively more oranges and fewer apples. Now, what economists would say is, okay, well, if they've shifted and they're buying now more oranges and fewer apples, then the cost increase of the apples is actually less significant, right? Because it's become a lower share of what they spend. So they were able to keep their fruit costs down overall. And so we should really look at the fact that there was lower cost increase in oranges. And as a result, say inflation hasn't necessarily been that high. And again, there's one way in which that's entirely sensible, but there's another way in which you would say, well, but wait a minute, I liked the apples. I like the apples more. That's why I had been buying those. And so, again, from one perspective, if you're just looking at what is the actual rise in budgetary costs and prices, yes, people are now buying more oranges and fewer apples. That's great news for keeping prices under control. But from another perspective, and here maybe apples and oranges seem silly, but if you think about the trade-off between, well, now you can get 5 flat screen televisions in every room, but you can't really afford healthcare, where and I'm saying, well, that's terrific. Then you'll buy more televisions. But that doesn't necessarily reflect the trade-offs as the family faces them.
Right. And I would imagine the average economist would mock this comment as somewhat ineffable and therefore not relevant. But I would say from the consumer perspective, there is something to be said for living in a world where you feel like you can generally get what you want. Obviously, we all have budgets. We all have to live within our means. But a world in which you're constantly having to shift to something to avoid some price increase is not going to feel like a world where you are winning from a consumer's perspective. Every time you're going to the grocery store, you're going, okay, well, I love apples, but the price is skyrocketing. I've got to move to oranges, and now oranges is up, so I've got to move to Cheez-Its. Some like not even in the fruit category. That's not while it may retain the overall price levels from a CPI perspective, calculation perspective, it's going to feel. I mean, there's simply an effect from a consumer perspective, the stress of that, the worry of that, the feeling that at any moment something you've relied on could be taken out of your budget because you just can't afford it anymore. That's obviously an almost impossible thing to measure, but that certainly doesn't mean that it's not what the average consumer's feeling.
Well, and I think that gets to an important point also. To your point, there's almost this sort of adjustment cost. But it also gets to a point that I think is really important, that, again, a way that economists might differ from how you or I might want to look at this, which is that I think we would say some things just matter more than others. That is, that we are entitled to, and in fact need to have, as a society, as a political community, some normative judgments about which goods and services matter most. And so, for instance, healthcare being a good example of this, there is something about feeling like you can afford healthcare for your family and won't be, in a position of someone in your family needing a treatment they can't afford. That is just materially different from how big your television is. And so while in the economic analysis, we just throw all of these things in together and ask, well, how much of each one are we buying and how are the prices of them moving? And skyrocketing healthcare costs can be offset by plummeting electronics costs. In practice, in particular, if the set of things you see rising in price, housing, healthcare, education, are in that category that we say really matters, and the things that are plummeting in price, plastic toys from China, electronics, and so on and so forth, you say that's nice. I'm glad those things are cheaper, but they're not the same kind of thing. It is a fundamentally political, not economic analysis, but that doesn't make it any less valid, I would say.
Well, shifting then from some of the issues with the CPI and PCE calculations, you submit in the Cost of Thriving Index report that not as a substitution for the CPI or the PCE, we should continue to run those calculations and use them to answer the economic questions that you articulate, but you submitted there should be an additional index, which you've titled the Cost of Thriving Index. Could you walk us through how that differs, how you constructed it, and then ultimately what it tells us about the direction our economy is going currently?
Yeah, so I started from that point I was just describing, that there are some things that I think we sort of say matter and are kind of foundational to being a member of the middle class and a full participant in our society. And we can acknowledge that those things are going to change over time, and that the way that we need to analyze the well-being of the typical family is not by asking, well, could they afford the exact set of things today that they could buy in 1970? Because of course we are not in 1970, but is instead saying, well, what is the set of things they would need to be able to buy today that is the equivalent of the set of things they might want to buy in 1970, bought in 1970, and what has happened to those? And so, you can understand why economists and government statisticians would immediately be concerned with this, because, well, who's gonna pick? There's no objective formula for choosing such things. And my view is that's fine. I'm going to do my version of it, and others can do theirs, and we will learn what we learn from it. And so what I said was just, what are the kind of major expenses that we associate with the typical middle-class family life? And the four that I looked at were a car, a essentially 3-bedroom house, a college tuition at a public university, and a health insurance plan. And I said, what those things look like in 2020 may be very different from what they looked like in 1970, and that's fine. Let's look at what it would have cost to buy those things then and what it costs to buy them now. And actually, it's a little hard to go that far back in the data. So I started in 1985, and I then just compare it to a median wage. So, and male wages historically and still today being higher are, I think, the kind of fairer point of comparison for asking what a family can afford. And I also in the appendix provide female wages and you look at two-earner households. But if you just look at the typical male wage in 1985 and say, how much of that annual wage would you have needed to buy the kind of typical middle of the road example of those four things? And the answer is you would need about 30 weeks of wages. So the majority of your earnings are going to that. But you also certainly have a bunch of flexibility.
Let me pause you real quick. When you say about 30 weeks of wages, you mean for the median worker?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep, that's right. And so, you then have the rest of the year's earnings to cover everything else and to save. And if some costs go up one year, there's room to work with. And you then, I fast forward ahead to 2018 and say, okay, what does it cost to buy those four things now? And the median male worker in 2018 would need 53 weeks worth of wages to buy the 2018 version of the package. That's obviously, there are two problems with that. One, there are fewer than 53 weeks in the year. And two, there are an awful lot of things you need to be able to buy that are not car, house, healthcare, and education. And so, we can talk about a whole bunch of critiques of this, most of which I think I do a pretty good job in the paper of saying, like, yes, there are many ways this is incomplete, but as a sort of general indication of why people feel like their budgets are getting squeezed, even if the official inflation data says wages are as high or higher than ever, I think that starts to kind of gesture at what has happened.
Yeah. So it sounds like, let me paraphrase what I'm hearing from you, and you can tell me if I've got it right. Certainly from the CPI and the PCE, that would suggest if you follow, I should say, you would need an additional element of our GDP increase as a nation over that period of time. It's absolutely true that the world has gotten better for the average person in the United States as far as the quality of goods and services that are available to them. The coverage, even in their healthcare, of like if something very strange, something that in 1970 would have been, I'm just hypothetically saying, would have been a terminal illness or completely untreatable, is now within the realm of things that medical science can deal with. That said, while the world is getting better, it is also in some ways getting harder, meaning that it is taking an additional amount of work to maintain. Let me use an analogy, and you can tell me where I've got this right or wrong. It's as if you moved from a smaller house into a larger house, and you're the only person in charge of maintenance. So you've got to do all the plumbing, you've got to do all the lighting, anytime anything breaks, you've got to fix it. While it is absolutely true that you now live in a better house, right? It's bigger, we'll say there's better furnishings, that kind of thing. You're probably going to have to dedicate more of your time and energy to maintaining said house. Does that work as an analogy for what the average consumer is going through? Where do I have it right? Where do I have it wrong there?
Yeah, I think that's a really nice analogy. I think the two additions I would make to it are one, that I think someone could look at that analogy and say, well, then just move back to the other house. And the reality is you can't move back to the other house. It doesn't exist. It's not, we have no time machines. And so I would say it's more like someone came along and bulldozed your old house and built you a new, bigger one. And there are some things that are great about this and some things that are not. And then I think the second thing I would say is that it's, and this I think is a very debatable point, but I think the evidence points strongly toward it, that there is so much more maintenance to do in this new house that you can't actually keep up with it. And so whereas, yes, you do have a bigger, better house, if you can't actually maintain it and it's falling into disrepair, even something that, you know, is assessed at whatever the value for that square footage might be, the experience of living in it might not be nearly what it was at the house you actually in the house you actually could maintain and, you know, properly furnish and so on and so forth. And so I think that sort of gets, you know, to the point. A key caveat I would add is that then there's a question of, okay, well, what are the things you do to close that gap, right? And so one big one is you're a lot more likely to have two earners in the workforce. And so that's a way, you know, you shift to more market labor and you're better able to afford these things. Of course, you miss out on the non-market labor that you would otherwise have been performing in your house and your community. And you also enter a vicious cycle where as more people do that, it drives up the costs in those ways we were talking about earlier. So that saying, well, but I would rather be the single earner household becomes less and less of a feasible option. And so I think you get this dynamic where it sort of builds upon itself. And whereas people have lots of options in theory, and to be sure, people do still choose lots of different things. I think you can go out and say, look, this is hard, but you can do it right. And there are plenty of ways to succeed. That's absolutely true. But I think it can also still be true that for the typical family, the set of pressures and trade-offs they're facing is much greater than it might have been in the past.
How would you say, let me see how I phrase this. It sounds like the unit of measurement you're sort of using when you calculate the cost of thriving index is that number of weeks worked at the median wage. How would you suggest, if this is added to the panoply of other inflation statistics that the government used, how might that inform policy? You know, obviously you've said that you're not looking to get rid of the CPI and PCE. Those are useful in a certain context. Could you explain to me how the cost of thriving index might be useful from a policymaker's perspective?
Yeah, I think there are two ways it's important. One is just as a diagnostic matter, and then one is the kinds of reforms it might point to. You know, as a diagnostic matter, I think it's really important to look at it and acknowledge the nature of the challenge. I think if you look out in policy debates today, you know, you have from the left of center a lot of times a narrative that just frankly isn't really tied to very much data, I would say, and is sort of just a, you know, general lament about the 1% and so forth, which, say what you will about the 1%, isn't really what's afflicting the typical family. And then on the right of center, I think you have sort of an overly formalistic focus on some of these economic measures we've been talking about, where you say, well, you know, technically, if we use the right deflator for the wages are a little bit higher than they were in prior decades. You have to take into account the fact that you have two people working and therefore there's more income and we're just going to ignore everything you lose if you have two people working. You know, and then on top of that, we're going to look at tax and benefit programs. And so, you know, I think a fair criticism of cost of thriving index is I ignore the fact that, well, there are lots of subsidies for healthcare and college, because yeah, those things help you, but also there are ways in which families neither understand them nor want to feel reliant on them. And so I think the right of center narrative focuses much more on, well, the technical economic measures are good and everybody's quality of life is higher, again, in sort of formal quality of stuff they get to enjoy. So what's the problem? And, you know, my goal with this project is to say, no, we can actually do a fairly good job on defining a package of things. I mean, for all the complaints about, well, how are we going to decide what's in the package? There haven't been a whole lot of people who have said, who have taken issue with this set of four as a good set to focus on, or said, well, these are wrong, or here are other ones you have to have in there. It's a fairly widespread starting point. And let's set a basic definition of how we're going to measure those things. And then let's actually keep track of what's happening to the cost of buying them, and recognize that they are rising a lot faster than wages are. And that is a problem. It is a problem in part driven by inequality, and is a problem that in turn, I think, leads to more inequality as the share of households that can save, for instance, gets squeezed. And so as a diagnostic matter, I think it's just important to be able to look at something like this and say, something has changed and it is causing problems for people, and we should be aware of it. In terms of what it means, I think one of the nice things about looking at it in these terms is it becomes very obvious then what the options are, right? I mean, there's one question of, well, why haven't wages risen faster? And what's been happening in the economy that's meant that, if you're in the kind of top quintile of the earnings distribution, your earnings have kept up just fine. And otherwise, frankly, they haven't. And so I think there are some really important structural economic questions there. And then on the flip side, what on earth is going on with these costs? I mean, why are these things going up so much in cost? And the answers tend to be very different category by category. But when you look at housing, I think there are real regulatory problems with how we do housing. And that's something I think, that there's an interesting coalition across the political spectrum that's very focused on these kind of NIMBY issues, and why you can't get good, affordable housing in the right places built anymore. And that should absolutely be a huge focus of our attention in that respect. I think, when you look at healthcare, you have to start to ask, like, well, what is the basic bundle here? What do we pay for? And what is a package that we could offer that is in line with what people can afford, and would get them access to the things they want and need? And I think one of the big debates about Obamacare is, while it provided a lot of subsidies to ensure more people could afford insurance, it also basically, I'm trying to think what's the opposite of the lowest common denominator. I guess it took this highest common denominator approach to saying the best possible gold standard package everywhere of every kind. Now just sort of, that's what health insurance means. Mm-hmm. And that both feeds into this problem and then contributes to rising healthcare costs. We have a whole discussion about higher education, obviously. And then even on things like cars, when you've got, like, why on earth are cars getting more expensive? And why aren't there entry-level vehicles that have been getting less expensive? You'd think if we were getting the right kinds of innovation, you could get a basic family sedan for much less than it used to cost. And there, I think the challenges are primarily regulatory, partly with respect to safety standards, partly with respect to environmental standards. But there's also a way in which all of the profit to be made in our market today is to be made serving the upper middle class. And so our economy is oriented around developing products for them. And that's an issue I think we have to think about and grapple with as well.
That's great. Let me ask you, put you in the hot seat here. Our discussion up till now has been fairly, academic is probably too strong a word, but about facts and figures and numbers and comparisons. We put you in the hot seat. So outside of policy, outside of those on Capitol Hill or in local state houses and local communities changing policy, what can the average consumer do about any of these things? Obviously, I should say, not obviously, it seems like what you're saying before is much of this inflation is, as they say, lumpy, meaning it's, food inflation may not be that high, but housing, healthcare, education has skyrocketed over the same period. Are there things that the average consumer should be thinking about, looking at when they make decisions to maybe avoid some of these cost increases in ways that, the CPI might be telling them, oh, no, there's no problem, there's no warning light. But the cost of thriving index may be saying, hey, you might want to think about these things as you plan your budget, plan your life, plan your decisions.
I think the one that comes to mind, and this is sort of the third big factor, we've talked about quality adjustment, we've talked about risk sharing. The third big factor that I incorporate into my measure that economists intentionally try to avoid is social norms. And my sort of quintessential example of this is like, you could stick with a 14-inch black and white TV, but you're probably not going to want to host a Super Bowl party, right? And so people very reasonably feel like they need the big flat screen TV. There's some kind of keeping up with the Joneses, but there's also like, that's because that's what it looks like to be a part of the community and the society. And the things your kids see advertised on TV are though you can't get them a hoop and a stick, right? And so I think that's an important thing for us to recognize. I think economists also at times have a good point when they say, well, wait a minute, let's distinguish what is actually needed for quality of life versus what is just a status marker. And while I would never want to minimize the importance that status has, I do think people can and should do a better job of being very conscious of where they are making an intentional choice that something is important to them versus where they're just sort of going along with what they feel like is expected or that they should do. I think two great examples of this. So not a great example of this is healthcare, right? Like it's not like people are out there like getting the gold-plated plan because they want to tell their friends at dinner they have the gold-plated plan. That I don't think really applies. But if you think about housing as an example, I am always struck by the house hunting shows where everyone like has all their huge list of must-haves and then invariably goes out and like then has to buy the house that's just a little bit above like the upper end of their range that they'd set. And like, that's usually not a good choice. Looking at your budget and asking like, what is the most my budget can afford isn't a good choice. Now, there are some things, being in a good neighborhood, being near, whether it being your work, being your family, real estate is still location. Obviously, safety and upkeep are very important. But all things considered, there has been a growth in the size of the average house in recent decades that I think is probably almost entirely uncorrelated with certainly people's needs and in fact their enjoyment and well-being. And to your point, corresponds to a heck of a lot of maintenance requirements. And so thinking seriously about, yes, the sort of norm is like, this is the kind of house I'm supposed to buy, but is there any actual reason for that? Or would I actually be much happier and, still be very proud of my house and provide a great home to my family and be in the place I want to be if I just go down 2 notches? I think that's the kind of thing people need to do a better job thinking about. And by the way, if more people did that, it would relieve pressure on housing prices. So, housing example, and then I think the same thing goes for higher education, where we have this attitude of, almost like more expensive must be better. And, how could I ever, tell my kid they can't go to whichever school they get into that has the best name. But the evidence is frankly quite clear that you are not getting much value for that. And again, there are exceptions and in certain elite institutions for certain specialties. But by and large, for the vast majority of people, first of all, the public university is every bit as good as a private one. And even within that, there's something that is, for instance, closer to home, that has less spectacular dormitories and stadiums, will have just as good an education. And so that's another place where I think we've gotten caught up in a status race that not only drives up costs, but honestly is making us probably less happy. And I think that's another place where people really being critically scrutinizing their choices and feeling less like, well, this is just the norm, so it's what I guess I have to pay, I think would be to their personal benefit and ultimately would be to the economy's benefit as well.
Great. Well, I have a follow-up question to that, but before I ask it, I want to note for our audience that We've opened a Q&A. I've got both the chat and the Q&A window up here, and I'll try and keep an eye on that. So please feel free to ask your questions for Oren. While we're waiting, giving people a chance to type their questions. Following up on that, what would you say? We did an event several months ago on lending standards in education, and sort of pointing out some of the strange differences in the amount of disclosures and consumer protections that exist if you're trying to take an auto loan or a home loan or a credit card out. But then for an 18-year-old, this is hyperbole, but basically you just need a FAFSA form and a student ID, and they will give you access to large sums of money. That then are not dischargeable in bankruptcy except for very, very narrow circumstances. What would you say? You mentioned education. We try to admonish our audience all the time to be savvy, educated consumers. One of the trends that you're seeing in education is a diminishing return over time for that degree. Now, I'm certainly not suggesting that education is not a valuable investment in most circumstances. But as far as trying to understand what the long-term return on investment would be, you take an 18-year-old. Have you done any work or seen any research on that? Because it's not just, hey, I got the degree. The return on investment is the amount of money I make at 22 versus what I would have made at 22 had I not gotten the degree. There's a whole lifetime of what the difference is, and then obviously you have to subtract from that the amount of investment that it required and the interest you had to pay on those loans. What would you say about that as far as sort of from a consumer perspective, thinking not just in the slice of time, but over the longevity of someone's career?
Well, the unsatisfying answer is it depends. And to your point, I think education is obviously incredibly valuable, and for some people, the 4-year bachelor's degree or a graduate degree is something they're going to make great use of and is going to pay real returns for them. That being said, I think all the evidence suggests that we are overeducating people. We are pushing people into more education than they're going to make good use of, and they are spending an awful lot of money on that. And I think the actual kind of cost in tuition is certainly a piece of that. But I always really encourage people to think more about the opportunity cost. In terms of, if you're thinking about 4 years, let's say, of college, what else could you have been doing with those 4 years? Just getting 4 years of experience somewhere. I mean, being somewhere with 5 years of experience, that's actually a lot of experience in a lot of cases. Not to mention that even if you're starting at $10 or $15 an hour, you're talking about not just not having to pay tuition, but having earned an extra $100,000+ during that period. And so where the college degree is actually the substantive, education that is going to get you moving the direction you want, then that can make perfect sense. But for an awful lot of folks, they're even if they're just thinking about the kind of jobs they want to pursue, important to keep in mind that almost 40% of college graduates then go into jobs that don't even require a degree anyway. For a huge share of the jobs out there, the right training is either a shorter, more targeted type of education, or more on the job experience. And then the last thing to say about it is you can always go to school later, right? If you get to be 28, 29, and then you realize, now I'm at a point in my career, now I know what I want to do. There are always going to be opportunities to pursue that. I think the worst thing you can do is say, well, I just graduated from high school, so that means I have to go to college next year. And both waste an opportunity you might make better use of later, waste time you could be doing something better, and waste an awful lot of money. So I think it's really important to think about that choice critically. On the flip side, for policymakers, I think it's really important to provide non-college pathways. We have built this college for all model where we say, our high schools are going to be college prep academies. Then we've got, literally $150 billion a year in subsidies for people going to college. And if you're doing something else, we basically say you get nothing. And so, really starting while kids are still in high school, but then especially afterward, saying, look, here are programs that we put just as much emphasis and energy into partnerships with private sector employers, subsidized initial years of work in some cases that say, you can get to be 2025, alternative types of credentialing in virtually any field, and be happier and more successful and have earned more and spent less without college. Public policy has a role to play in that, and we have to do a much better job, because at the end of the day, like, what is the share of jobs in the world for which sitting in a classroom and reading and writing about stuff for 4 years is the right preparation? I mean, you and I both happen to have such jobs, and a challenge is that most policymakers do, and they're therefore very squeamish about saying anything besides, well, that's obviously what everyone should do. But they're doing everyone a disservice. And so having a much broader view of what pathways into adulthood should look like, I think, has to be part of the equation as well.
Absolutely. Well, we do have an audience question. I think you touched on some of these before, but I think there's a nuance to this. So I'm going to try and do the question justice. Focusing on prices and notions of inflation might be contributing to a sense of helplessness. Which strategies can individuals and households use to make optimal choices within their given income? And obviously, we've talked about some of the things you suggest, but getting at that sense of helplessness, certainly not. In the title of this was the American dream, and that's certainly not an American aspect. We never, we're not a people known for a sense of helplessness. Is there anything you could suggest to our audience that might feel this number creeping up, these number of work weeks that they're needing going up, to encourage them to feel like they are still masters, that they have agency?
Well, I think we've been focusing on the kind of the big bucket costs, and from a budgeting perspective, that's just incredibly important, and something I would emphasize. There's a famous kind of example in human psychology of you ask somebody, would you go across the street to save, to get a book for $10 instead of $20? They say yes. And then you say, well, okay, would you go across the street to, get a car for $19,990 instead of $20,000? And they say, like, no, probably not. Right. Although either way, you're going across the street to save $10. And right. So we seem to, we take very different approaches to our big costs and our little costs. And really, in part because they feel like they're more in our control, I think we focus an awful lot on saving money on those little costs, and the bringing the coupons to the grocery store, and knowing which gas station is 3 cents a gallon cheaper. And I'm not here to say not to do that. I think being cost conscious is incredibly important. It's important to remember, though, that the difference between choosing the $50,000 a year college versus $48,000 a year college, let alone versus the $15,000 a year public college, erases in the first year, erases the lifetime of work you try to do saving on all those other things. Mm-hmm. The same goes for, really understanding your health plan and knowing what is in network versus out of network. The first time you don't use an in-network doctor when you could have, the cost of that is going to wipe out most of what you saved on those smaller day-to-day decisions. And so refocusing some of the time you spend on those day-to-day decisions on getting the big things right, we talk about house shopping, obviously, that's something you hopefully aren't doing too often, on understanding how your health plan works, on understanding what your options are for higher education, on maintaining your car well so that it lasts longer. Mm-hmm. Those just have a much, much bigger influence at the end of the day. And I think this goes a little bit to the difference between the cost of thriving index thinking and the CPI thinking. It's very funny to actually look at how they do the CPI, and they literally have it defined down to like, well, how much does the typical household spend on like bacon versus hamburger each year, right? And they have to like actually measure that to the decimal point. And they literally send people out to grocery stores all over the country to check on the prices of bacon versus hamburger. And like, I can't even say with a straight face, like, I'm sure that's really a great use of our time. But even let's say I'm glad there's some government agency doing that. The fact that we don't have 10 times as many people working on trying to understand what are the major costs for the typical household and how have those evolved is just a huge miss, I think, for how we think about the economy and the pressures that families are under.
Absolutely. Well, we're coming up at the end of the hour, but before I let you go and let our audience go, we want to be respectful of time. We're now a year on. I think we just came up on the 1-year anniversary of the publication of the report, if I have that correct. In now a year of retrospect, what do you feel has been the impact of the report, and are there any changes, any improvements, like in any sense of hope? Have you seen any sense that there might be some changing attitudes towards putting the C back in CPI, putting the consumer back in consumer price inflation?
Yeah, I think it's been interesting to see, especially in the wake of its release. I think it set off some really good debates just about what matters to us, like that what are we actually fighting about as policymakers, and so, for instance, and sorry, to clarify, what are we fighting about as policymakers in a political environment? What is it that our politics actually thinks matters? And to what extent are we here to just say we just need an efficient economy and everyone can then allocate their resources accordingly, versus to what extent do we feel comfortable saying, no, there are some things that are kind of our definition of the American dream or the good life that deserve to be analyzed differently. And so I think that conversation in and of itself has been really valuable and has created some space for people to make those kinds of arguments, to be willing to say, yes, I agree that the hedonic adjustments say X, but I also care about Y. And I think that's just a healthier way to have these debates. And then I think the other thing that has shifted a little bit is I think people feel more comfortable making the assertion that family budgets are getting squeezed. For better and for worse, we are kind of obsessed with data, and having that talking point that you can point to that shows that there is support for a point. And I think there hadn't been enough work done to quantify what had been happening to household budgets, and so I'd be the first to say what I did was only a starting point. And I think a lot of the critiques that came back on various ways to refine it, on how to think about what about employer-sponsored insurance versus insurance you buy yourself. I think those were all exactly the right conversations to then get into. But the great thing about all of them was we were then having the conversation based on what are the choices families actually have and the ways they feel constrained, instead of just what is the inflation-adjusted absolute amount of stuff. Because I do think we should celebrate that people can afford more stuff than they used to, and the stuff is of higher quality. That's true and great, and I'm not for going back and living in log cabins, but we have to, alongside that, be able to talk about the ways that our economy's evolution is really creating a lot of unprecedented pressures.
Great. Well, Oren, thank you so much for joining us today. Audience, appreciate you joining in as well. Next month will be date TBD. But we'll be talking about some of these ways in which consumers can reduce their costs, specifically in K through 12 education. Obviously, there's been an unprecedented amount of change in that space in the last year, and we are going to have a great panel for you in about a month on those topics and all the options that are now available to parents in that space. So it feeds right into some of these areas where we've seen a lot of inflation. Oren, thank you again for joining us and talking about that.
Yeah, this was great. Thanks for having me.